Last month at Interior.
Secretary Haaland this week took action to protect the cultural and historic resources surrounding Chaco Culture National Historical Park from new oil and gas leasing and mining claims. A new order withdraws public lands within a 10-mile radius of the national park for 20 years, subject to valid existing rights. The move responds to decades of efforts from tribes, elected officials, and the public to better protect the sacred and historic sites and tribal communities currently living in northwest New Mexico. Interior this week announced plans to infuse $161 million into ecosystem restoration and resilience on the nation's public lands as part of the president's Investing in America agenda. The Bureau of Land Management will spearhead the work, which will focus on 21 restoration landscapes across 11 western states, ranging from wildlife habitat restoration in the sagebrush steppe of the high desert to recreating wetland meadows to repairing watersheds on former industrial timberlands. In celebration of Great Outdoors Month and National Trails Day, Secretary Haaland announced the designation of 9 new national recreation trails in 9 states. That adds 340 miles to the national trail system managed by the National Park Service. The newly designated trails join a network of more than 1,300 existing national recreation trails, which can be found in every U.S. state, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Interior this week announced that nearly $725 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law is available to 22 states and the Navajo Nation to reclaim abandoned coal mine lands. The law provides a total of $11.3 billion in abandoned mine land funding over 15 years through the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement, which will help communities create good-paying jobs and catalyze economic opportunity while cleaning up dangerous environmental conditions. Assistant Secretary for Water and Science Tanya Trujillo joined other federal officials, as well as state, local, and tribal partners, to celebrate the Taylor Slough Flow Improvement Project ribbon cutting this week. The project will increase the flow of clean fresh water to the Florida Bay, where it's needed to balance salinity levels and promote ecological health. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is celebrating a milestone this week, the approval of the 100th tribal regulation under the Helping Expedite and Advance Responsible Tribal Home Ownership Act of 2012. The Hearth Act promotes tribal self-determination by making a voluntary alternative land leasing process available to federally recognized tribes. The National Park Service this week awarded 14 grants totaling approximately $3.4 million through the Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant Program. The grants will fund a variety of projects aimed at preserving and interpreting the history of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. A new study from the U.S. Geological Survey and its partners shows how Yellowstone's grizzly bear population is adapting to a changing ecosystem. Grizzlies need substantial body fat to withstand months of hibernation, even as their traditional food sources have diminished due to climate change and human activity. The study shows grizzlies have learned to shift to other available food sources within the Yellowstone ecosystem to maintain the same levels of body fat. And our social media picture of the week, the promise of a new day at Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge, where sunlight burns through the fog and bursts through a burl oak tree on a serene Minnesota morning, casting light upon magnificent wildflowers. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.
Last month at Interior.
Secretary Haaland and Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs Brian Newland traveled to Minnesota this week for a series of events and meetings with tribes and tribal communities. They hosted the 7th stop on the Road to Healing. That's a year-long tour across the country to provide Native survivors of the federal Indian boarding school system and their descendants an opportunity to share their experiences. They also took part in a public hearing convened by the Not Invisible Act Commission. That's part of a joint effort by the Departments of the Interior and Justice to develop recommendations to guide Congress and federal agencies to combat the crisis of missing and murdered indigenous peoples and human trafficking. Interior this week announced a nearly $64 million investment from the bipartisan infrastructure law to clean up more than 300 orphaned oil and gas well sites in national parks, forests, wildlife refuges, and on other public lands and waters. Methane emissions from many of these unplugged wells presents a serious safety hazard and contributes to climate change. The move is part of an historic $16 billion through the president's Investing in America agenda to address legacy pollution across the nation. It will create good-paying union jobs, catalyze economic growth, and revitalization. The 2023 Atlantic hurricane season has arrived, and through November, the U.S. Geological Survey will provide science to help protect lives and property if a storm threatens American shores. USGS has a range of comprehensive scientific capabilities that can inform decision makers, emergency managers, and communities as they prepare for, respond to, and recover from a storm. That includes forecasting coastal change, tracking storm surge and coastal flooding, and measuring river levels and inland flooding across entire regions. June is National Ocean Month, and this week marks World Ocean Day, celebrating the precious resource that touches every aspect of our lives. The ocean helps sustain livelihoods, influences our climate and weather patterns, and serves as a place for exploration and recreation. Interior is working hard to conserve the ocean by ensuring everyone has access to our nation's coastal and marine environments, investing in a clean energy future, reducing plastic pollution on interior managed lands, and setting a goal of conserving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 through the America the Beautiful initiative. Interior hosted the next generation of public servants this week at the Office of Personnel Management's Intern Experience Program launch. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, Management, and Budget Joan Mooney spoke at the event, which also featured astronauts from NASA and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, who have all just returned from their recent mission to the International Space Station. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service this week announced that more than $24 million in funding has been approved for conservation projects to benefit migratory birds throughout the Americas under the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. There are 390 species of birds that migrate across the Western Hemisphere to and from the U.S. each year, including songbirds, shorebirds, and birds of prey. The National Park Service joined the U.S. Mint this week to celebrate the release of the new Eleanor Roosevelt Quarter. The new coin honors the nation's longest-serving First Lady, who was also a delegate to the United Nations, diplomat, and human rights activist. Are you ready to get outdoors? Saturday, June 10th is National Get Outdoors Day. It's an annual event intended to inspire and motivate Americans to get outside for a healthy, fun day of outdoor adventure. We'll be celebrating America's wild spaces for the rest of June as we mark Great Outdoors Month. And our social media picture of the week, the towering crimson-colored rock formations of Utah's Bryce Canyon National Park. It was 100 years ago this week that Bryce Canyon was first preserved as a national monument before its designation as a national park 5 years later. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.
Last month at Interior.
The Supreme Court this week upheld the Indian Child Welfare Act, a 1978 law that was passed to protect indigenous children, keep families together, and safeguard the future of tribal nations, following centuries of policies that promoted the forced removal of indigenous children from their families and communities. Secretary Haaland celebrated the ruling, saying in part that the decision is a welcome affirmation across Indian country of what presidents and congressional majorities on both sides of the aisle have recognized for the past 4 decades. Secretary Haaland visited Massachusetts and Rhode Island this week, where she highlighted how the president's Investing in America agenda is restoring our nation's lands and waters and expanding outdoor recreation access. In Massachusetts, she toured the High Street Dam Removal Project in Bridgewater, where a $1.5 million investment from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will restore the river and support aquatic connectivity. In Rhode Island, she visited the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park, celebrating its establishment as a National Park Service unit. During her visit to both states, she met with tribal leaders, discussing a broad range of issues, including economic development, the impacts of climate change, and the sustainable development of offshore wind. Secretary Haaland and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack outlined their visions and goals this week when it comes to managing wildland fires. The agencies plan to have more than 17,000 wildland firefighters on board by the end of this year to help support communities increasingly impacted by wildfires. Air resources, heavy equipment, and other support personnel are also ready to respond as wildfire activity increases. The president's fiscal year 2024 budget proposal would enable the departments to continue providing the country's federal wildland fire workforce with improved and well-deserved benefits. Meanwhile, as wildfires continue to burn in Canada, additional Interior and USDA firefighters and resources are on the way to assist with ongoing wildfire suppression efforts. Since May, more than 800 U.S. firefighters have traveled to provide support in Canada, including 6 incident management teams and 34 interagency hotshot crews. With increased fire activity across the provinces, multiple requests for resources from the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre are being filled for Alberta, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Quebec. That includes hand crews, incident management teams, fire line leadership positions, and various aviation assets. The Bureau of Land Management this week announced a proposed update of its renewable energy regulations to promote the development of solar and wind energy on public lands. The proposed rule would reduce development fees nationwide and facilitate responsible development, consistent with the administration's efforts to permit 25 gigawatts of clean energy on public lands by 2025 and a transition to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. The Bureau of Reclamation is taking the first steps to develop new operating guidelines to protect the Colorado River after the current guidelines expire in 2026. The public process will gather feedback for the next set of operating guidelines, including new strategies that take into account the current and projected hydrology of the Colorado River Basin. Nearly $580 million went out from Interior this week to more than 1,900 local communities nationwide. The funds are known as PILT, or Payment in Lieu of Taxes. That's money that Interior reimburses local jurisdictions, compensating them for the non-taxable federal lands within their boundaries. PILT payments help local governments carry out vital services, everything from firefighting and police protection to public school and road construction. The National Park Service welcomed America's newest citizens this week, as more than 200 people took their oaths of citizenship at Mount Rushmore National Monument. And our social media picture of the week comes from Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in southwest Oklahoma. The refuge is renowned for its impressive herds of bison, longhorn, and Rocky Mountain elk. It also provides excellent recreational activities such as fishing, bird watching, wildlife photography, hiking, camping, and kayaking. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.
Last month at Interior.
Secretary Haaland and Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks Shannon Estenos were in Hawaii this week to highlight how President Biden's Investing in America agenda is helping to protect iconic Hawaiian bird species, strengthen the native Hawaiian community, and invest in the science and infrastructure that support our public lands and waters. Among her stops, the Secretary visited with staff from Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge and toured Keauhou Bird Conservation Center, following her announcement that Interior has committed nearly $16 million to prevent the imminent extinction of Hawaiian forest birds, part of $2 billion in investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act to restore lands and waters and advance climate resilience. She met with members of the native Hawaiian community to discuss the intergenerational impacts of assimilationist policies, including federal Indian boarding schools, and highlighted Interior's commitment to working with indigenous communities to protect our lands and waters and revitalize native languages. And Secretary Haaland, Senator Brian Schatz, and U.S. Geological Survey Director David Applegate took part in a ground blessing ceremony in Hilo for a new facility that will house 2 USGS science centers, the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory and the Pacific Island Ecosystems Research Center. The Bureau of Land Management held an auction for utility-scale solar energy development in Nevada this week, resulting in a record-breaking $105.15 million in high bids. The auction of 4 parcels across nearly 24,000 acres in the Armagosa Desert could support close to 3 gigawatts of renewable energy to the electrical grid. It's the highest yielding onshore renewable energy auction in the Bureau's history. Interior is celebrating the groundbreaking of the Transwest Express Transmission Project. That's a new high-voltage interregional transmission line that will extend from south-central Wyoming through northwestern Colorado and central Utah, ending in southern Nevada. The transmission line will add more than 1,000 jobs during construction and, once complete, will provide 3,000 megawatts of new transmission capacity. The Bureau of Indian Education has awarded an additional 5-year contract to increase access for behavioral health and wellness support to all students and staff at Bureau-funded schools and programs. The program was initially designed to increase access to services during the COVID-19 pandemic. It provides virtual counseling and on-site crisis services at all Bureau-funded schools and programs with Indigenous-focused, evidence-based, and trauma-informed behavioral health and wellness support. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service this week announced it's expanding hunting opportunities on approximately 3,000 acres in 3 national wildlife refuges: Cahaba River National Wildlife Refuge in Alabama, Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge in Florida, and Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge in Minnesota. The Fish and Wildlife Service is also proposing a phase-out of lead ammunition and tackle at 8 national wildlife refuges because of adverse effects on human and wildlife health. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management this week proposed an update to 20-year-old regulations to protect American taxpayers from the costs of decommissioning offshore wells and infrastructure. If approved, they'll ensure that energy companies are financially prepared to take on their responsibilities while protecting the taxpayer from incurring the associated costs. Interior welcomed more than 200 small businesses to the Denver Federal Center last week for an Industry Day. That's an event that supports Interior's priorities by growing and diversifying the department's small business vendor base. The Industry Day was designed to promote the administration's historic investments through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. And our social media picture of the week, the dazzling synchronous fireflies of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. These fireflies are one of at least 19 firefly species that live in the park and one of only a few species in the world known to synchronize their flash patterns. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. That's This Week at Interior.